This is such a transformative, revolutionary thing for the auto industry. It's forcing the car companies to really just reinvent themselves, question what is their core DNA, what do they do? Because that used to be the engine, that Hemi engine, or that was like your DNA, that was who you are.
That was the voice of Gabrielle Coppola. She is a journalist over at Bloomberg, and today we're going to be talking about the future of the auto industry. Welcome to your Daily Detroit for Monday, January 8th, 2024. I am Jer Stays. Before we jump into it, thank you so much to our members on Patreon, patreon.com/Daily Detroit. Without you, conversations like this just aren't possible. So thank you. One of the topics that listeners, whether it's to the podcast inbox, on social media, anything like else. Look, Detroit is the center of the auto industry, and a big change, possibly the biggest change in the history of the industry, is going on right now. And that is around electric vehicles, batteries, changes in locomotion. Like, these are issues that are getting into the core of everything. And with all the buzz happening around it, I figured that I wanted to talk to somebody way smarter than me. And that person is Gabrielle Coppola, a reporter over at Bloomberg. There's this piece that she did a little while ago, and we're going to talk about it and expand upon it, called America's Long Tortured Journey to Build EV Batteries. I'll put a link in the show notes to this, but we're going to talk about that and a lot more, aren't we?
Yes.
And welcome to Daily Detroit. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you for having me.
I guess, why don't we set the table with what's going on with batteries right now? Because I've been to a number of events lately, being as, when you cover Detroit, there's no way you don't end up being around the auto industry somehow. There is so much energy around electric batteries. Some saying, look, we've got to go all in. We've got to get everything together to make this happen. There's other folks who are like, this is hogwash. This is not going to ever happen in America. We have to, there's so much division on this thing. What's the facts on the ground? Where are we at right now, Gabrielle?
When you talk about this, you really have to distinguish between where are we in the United States and what's happening in the rest of the world. The biggest car market in the world is China. And China is rapidly going electric, and they've been working on that for about 10 years. And, now they've built up this big domestic industry to make EVs and batteries. They're looking to export those electric cars and batteries around the world. And they're starting to make inroads in Europe, and they've started to look at the United States. And that's where I think you get into a lot of the controversy and a lot of what's been going on here. People may be familiar with President Biden, his big signature climate change law, the Inflation Reduction Act. That was a really big deal from a policy perspective, and it really tries to do two things, some of which are kind of contradictory and very hard to do, but basically it has two goals. One, advance electrification in the United States, like get more people to buy electric cars, but at the same time, start to wean the U.S. off its dependence on China, especially when it comes to the supply chain for electric vehicles. Where we are now, well, we can talk about the consumer market. EVs have been growing at a pretty fast clip, but from a very small base. And they've been growing, but what we've seen, especially being in Detroit, we feel it here, is that a lot of the car companies like Ford, like GM, who were very, very bullish on electric vehicles and said, this is the future, and we got to get in here, and really thought they made the perfect plan and invested billions of dollars. And now they're finding that it's harder than they expected, both to make them. I think, you've seen GM has struggled with some of its battery manufacturing, which, by the way, battery manufacturing is not easy. I mean, even the biggest, global battery makers in the world, CATL, LG, Panasonic, it's hard. And you make a lot of mistakes along the way. There's a lot of bumps along the road to get there. So I don't think it's shocking that they had a problem, but yeah, they had a problem. So that's on the supply side. And then on the demand side, I think they're realizing that, not everybody wants to jump on this bandwagon because there are real issues. I think the two biggest ones are A, they're too expensive still. They're not on par with, combustion engine vehicles. And B, our charging infrastructure is not here yet. I think EV sales are still growing. They're just growing at a slower pace. So that's what's happening right now. I do think that in the long term, this is the direction of where we're going. Electric vehicles are the future. And it's just a question of who is going to survive and thrive and be able to pull off this transformation to be a part of that. I think we can get into that more, have that conversation, because I know it is something that you and I were just talking about before we started that people have very strong feelings about, especially here in Detroit. And so I'd love to kind of get into some of that and talk about that with you eventually, because I think there's a lot of fear and anxiety, and I think a lot of that is justified, but we also need to take a big picture look at this and take a long-term view of it. My personal feeling is that you can't really stick your head in the sand on this one.
So electric's the way we're going, because there were some people who I've seen say, well, is there going to be another tech? Should I wait out? Whatever. Electric, that's the direction the globe is going, from your estimation.
Well, that's a good point. I've talked to people who are just like big, deep, hardcore powertrain engineers and people from the Department of Energy I've spoken to. They'll say we shouldn't be putting all our eggs in this battery basket. But they all say that there has to be, whether it's hydrogen or these alternative fuels. And I think some of like Stellantis, for example, has talked a lot about looking at different forms of clean energy. I think there's an acknowledgement that we need to move to a low carbon, or we need to reduce our emissions, or the planet's, people can debate about that too, but there's a general consensus, certainly in industry and with a lot of governments around the world, that climate change is an issue and that we need to move towards cleaner technology regardless, whether or not it's lithium ion batteries or something else. I think the car companies are looking at alternative methods because there has been a big supply crunch for battery materials. I mean, the prices have come down a bit now, but for a while there, everybody was rushing to the trough at the same time to buy up all the same minerals. And so that made the price go up, which made the electric vehicles look even more expensive. So people were saying, geez, what else can we do to, clean up our emissions without just all using this one technology? But the flip side of that is that if you're going to commercialize a technology, you need scale. So you have to build a lot of cars in order to make that technology to be profitable. And so that requires you, to some degree, I think you do have to pick a horse, because you need to take something and build on it to the point where it becomes big enough that you can make money. I'll say that I think there probably are viable other technologies, and people talk about, well, maybe batteries aren't the best, and that may be true in the long run, but they're what is around right now. And there's a sense of urgency for a lot of companies and a lot of stakeholders that we can't wait for the perfect. We have to do something now. And a lot of people think that means, using battery-powered electric vehicles.
I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but there is a number. I think it's near 100,000, something like that, of vehicles that a company or factory needs to produce in order to be able to be like, okay, we can start printing money. We can start making money on this thing. And, when you're at volumes of 30, 40,000 vehicles, you're losing money on that kind of nameplate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the number changes depending on how big your plant is and what the capacity is. But certainly, you're right. There's like a magic number to break even and start making money. And that's what Detroit is going through right now. The car companies they've invested this money to make EVs, and they're not selling enough, and they're not profitable yet because they're still working to get the cost down to make the EV. Because it's basically like you've been making cars for 100 years. Now you got to learn this whole new technology, and they have to master it. And I mean, if you look at Tesla's doing it now, but Tesla really struggled for a long, long time. It's just they've been going through that struggle for a lot longer than, the Detroit automakers have because they started earlier.
Yeah, I was thinking about that myself too. That's a really good point. So to get to that division, to circle back to that, I'll share a little story that I was out getting Punchki at Punchki Day a little while ago. I don't remember exactly, but was on the street on Joe's Campo in Hamtramck and talking to a listener. Hope they're still with us. And we were getting into electric cars, vehicles, things like that. We gotten onto the subject somehow. But other people in the line who worked around automotive were very upset when they overheard this conversation. And electric vehicles, in some ways, have become an identity issue. They have become a political issue. And there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, especially with people around the auto industry or people connected to it in any way going, is my job at risk? What am I going to lose? And that is the frame that I see a lot of Detroit and Michigan look at. There was a stat recently that came out that only 4% of sales in Michigan are electric, but out in California, it's like 25%. And there's other states with a lot more than Michigan for sure. And that cultural identity and also like fear of losing your job or your income, I think is this storm that I think we have to wrestle with here in Michigan.
Oh, yeah. And, I don't want to dismiss those concerns at all. I mean, they're real. I was just looking at a presentation that Ford gave back in 2017. I think this was like the genesis of a lot of the job loss predictions. They said, we've done a study of what the, electric car factory of the future will look like. And they said, we think it will take 30% fewer hours to make that electric car. That's less labor, right? So that's less work for people. There's also the fact that, just mechanically electric vehicles are more simple. You don't have this combustion engine with a catalytic converters, all these parts. You don't have a lot of that stuff. It's just there's fewer parts. So I think there's no doubt. Okay, I'm not going to say there's no doubt, but in the long run, it does look like that. But I've talked to some really smart people about this. It's going to take, 5-10 years longer for that change to happen. And of course, it also depends on the demand for EVs here. If people are still buying gas cars, they're going to have to make gas cars. Maybe they'll be hybrids. This is such a transformative, revolutionary thing for the auto industry. It's forcing the car companies to really just reinvent themselves, question what is their core DNA? What do they do? Because that used to be the engine, that Hemi engine, or, that was like your DNA. That was who you are.
Horsepower is in all the advertising. And you can go back into the books, and you go to the Burton Library, you go wherever and see old auto ads. And it's all about, the new power steering or all these other things that are complicated things. I mean, right now, the car is the most complicated consumer product that is out there.
Yeah. And look, I don't think EVs are simple either. I mean, the battery and the battery chemistry and the software you use to manage the battery, that stuff is definitely very complicated too. But it's just more, I think overall, the powertrain is more streamlined. Right now, the car makers are trying to learn about batteries and trying to make, some of them have declared or maybe they're not quietly, they're looking at making their own batteries, or they have these joint ventures with a lot of the, Korean battery manufacturers. But they're also doing things to preserve some of those jobs because they're learning a new technology. They want to do a lot of it in-house. I mean, if you look at Tesla is all about vertical integration. They're trying to make their own batteries. So I think the automakers in Detroit too, and everywhere, they're looking at that. So I think they're bringing stuff in-house. And you saw that with the latest UAW contract. I think, Ford, I remember, talked about that, making, I don't want to get it wrong, I think motors or, other pieces. The car companies may do that work and bring it in-house because they are trying to master this new technology and learn how to put all the pieces together in the most efficient way. And that they're going to keep some of those jobs. We're going to make those, they say, okay, you may lose this, guy who's doing castings for, the engine or something. But look, we're going to do this other thing over here. So it's not real clear yet what the net loss is. Okay, I want to make that point that it's not automatic. I think there's a transition. But yeah, I mean, I think in the long term, if you look at a battery plant, the jobs are also very different. It's not the kind of thing that necessarily, today people work in an auto plant for 30 years. They really, do great damage to their body. You do this repetitive motion over and over again. People have all kinds of surgeries, but you're basically doing one thing, over and over again. I think at a battery plant, from what I understand, it's really more like you're a technician babysitting a machine and you're making sure the machine is working okay, because batteries are just the nature of them. You're working with chemistry, like these chemical reactions. So you don't want a lot of human intervention because that can create problems. There'll still be stuff like high-low drivers or materials handlers. And, I don't want to go over my skis here. I'm not running a battery plant, but from what I understand, it's the nature of the work is going to be different. But yeah, I mean, it's going to bring change. And over the long term, yes, it may be fewer jobs, but there's a lot of other moving pieces I don't think we have our heads around yet.
Yeah, you're talking about the job portion, but I also think about the supplier base because, well, not only if you need fewer things or different things, there are some suppliers that are working to adapt and make some changes. But I also think, well, if you were somebody who just provided that one part for something that's part of a gas engine or something, there could be some shakeups over there too in the supplier base.
Yes, absolutely. That's something I probably haven't looked at enough, really, to be honest. But yes, I mean, I know a lot of the big global tier one suppliers, they've all been seeing this coming and they've been working to build their product portfolio to, Magna, Aptiv, Borg Warner, all those big companies. But what does that mean for the smaller guys? Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a great question because they don't have the resources and the kind of R&D resources to reinvent themselves and invest in like a brand new technology like that. So that is scary, and that's a good point.
The news has been filled with all kinds of discussion about battery plants, in part because there's been some serious state juice behind supporting battery plants and battery things. There's talk about something over on Paquette in the city of Detroit. There's, of course, that giant Ford Marshall battery plant. There's other examples of, hey, we really need to have this battery production in Michigan. But this piece that you did, which is about a startup's failure, A123 out of Michigan, and some of the things that have happened from it, It's a haunting tale if you know about it. And so why don't we talk about that? So it feels like we missed an opportunity that it seems like a Chinese company has really been able to seize on.
Yeah, well, what do they say? Past is prologue. I think that's there's a lot of truth in that when you look at this. I'll just tell you about how I got into the story because I think that tells you a lot. A couple of years ago, I said, wow, I think batteries are going to be like a really big deal. Let me try to understand this. And it was because I was listening to Tesla's Battery Day, actually, and I was listening to Elon Musk talk, and he was just saying all these words that I didn't understand what they meant. And I was like, geez, if I can't even, I'm supposed to be covering the auto industry. I don't even understand this language he's speaking. I better, look into this. And I started to learn about for electric vehicles in the world today, there's two like really dominant battery chemistries that people use. There's the nickel based, like nickel metal, cobalt, NCM. That's what like Tesla's first vehicles are made from. That's what the Chevy Bolt has. It's really what most electric vehicles in the West have. It's nickel based batteries. But if you look at China, China took a very different route. They went with this other chemistry called lithium iron phosphate, which is LFP. And, when you think about batteries, people make a lot of comparisons to like baking because it's all about mixing these different ingredients in very precise proportions. And then when you do that, you get a certain range of the battery and how much power and how much torque you get. All of that depends on the chemistry and, the way you package the battery. So we went with nickel because we were like, we want power, we want range. This is America, long distance driving. That we want nickel based batteries. That's power and range. In China, they said, well, we're going to start with like building our bus fleets, and they don't have to have like great torque and great power. They're going to go recharge every so often. So they did LFP, and the benefit of this LFP chemistry is that it's much more stable. So it's less, not perfect, but it's less prone to fire risk. And it's a lot cheaper because iron, one of the key ingredients, is very abundant. It's a lot easier to come by versus the nickel one has cobalt, which that's when people criticize EVs and talk about kids hand digging for cobalt in the Congo and all that horrible stuff, which is indeed horrible. That's what you get. And so, companies have been trying to work on that battery chemistry to get cobalt out of it. So you don't have to use that, but people still use it. Basically, that's LFP. LFP is like, just think of it as like ice cream flavors. LFP is like a different ice cream flavor. But as EVs have grown, people are like, wow, that LFP, wow, it's really good. You don't have the fire risk or fewer, lower fire risk. And wow, if we just do this stuff with the battery pack and engineer it, we can actually make it more powerful. So wow, maybe that's a good thing. And it's so much cheaper. And when all those battery prices were going up, LFP was looking even better. And so what I've been watching is, for my little post in Detroit, I am very focused on China. Like, to me, that's the biggest story in the world, is like China Inc. and, their economic might and their manufacturing might. And so I started to look at LFP and the Chinese battery manufacturers like CATL. That's the one who partnered with Ford in Michigan for this Marshall plant. I started to look at them. I said, wow, the LFP keeps gaining more and more share. This is going to be like a big part of the future. Wow. And then I started to learn about LFP. And that's where I get into this very long preview to what my story is about. Is I found out, I said, wow, LFP was actually invented in the United States. I said, what? How could that be? Like, this is like the Chinese big battery product. This is like what dominates the entire Chinese economy. And then I started to dig in, and it turns out that LFP was, discovered by a group of scientists in the 90s. Professor John Goodenough, who recently passed away, but he was a brilliant inventor. He was at the UT Austin. He discovered LFP, and basically there were a bunch of startups that tried to commercialize it and turn it into a real product. And the biggest, most successful one was a company called A123, which was actually started by a professor of MIT in Boston, but they started to go after the auto industry. And so they had big operations in Michigan. And that's where people may remember this was all around leading up to 2008. So they started off making, batteries for like power drills and stuff like that. And they said, we want to get into the auto business. And they were talking to all the big three. And this was a time when the big three were sliding into bankruptcy or near bankruptcy and asking for money from the government to bail them out, as we all remember. And Obama said, okay, like, we'll give you this money, but you need to focus on making more fuel efficient cars. You can't just rely on these gas guzzlers. You got to try to make at least a hybrid or something. And the automaker said, okay. And so that kind of gave A123 an in to try to get some business. And they got business with Chrysler. There was a time when Chrysler was looking at doing a bunch of hybrid cars, talking about electric cars. But what happened was, kind of like now, the market wasn't there because, as you remember, gas prices had gotten so high, and that's why, part of what helped spark the recession. And then once the Great Recession happened, gas prices fell. Everyone said, "Ooh, gas is cheap again. Okay, give me that Chevy Suburban. Let me go back to my big gas guzzling SUV. I don't care." And so all these small compact cars, or the Chevy Volt, which was a big innovative step forward for GM, but wasn't a huge commercial success. The market didn't want it. So A123, which thought they were kind of on the path to getting some real deals here, saw a lot of their customers back away. When Sergio Marchionne took over Chrysler, he's famous for not being a fan of EVs. He just thought they were a way to lose money, and he hated them. And he, basically cut the deal with A123. What happened was they went bankrupt. I mean, I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but this company went bankrupt, and there was a bankruptcy proceeding. And this company, Wangsheng, which is the biggest auto supplier in China at the time, bid for their assets. And there was other companies that tried to come. Johnson Controls tried to come in and bid. They tried to get an American buyer, but at the end of the day, CFIUS approved it. That's I forget what CFIUS stands for, but they basically look at all these business transactions and make sure it doesn't violate American national security. And it was very political. If you go back and look at the time, there were a lot of Republicans in Michigan who were saying you should not sell this to the Chinese. This is not a good idea. But that's just the way capitalism works. If you're an investor in this company and you want to sell it to the highest bidder, because that's going to mean more money for you, you're going to be made whole. So the Chinese company won, and they said they were going to keep all these jobs in Michigan, but over time they kind of really moved a lot of the core operations to China. The reason it's significant now is it's not that I'm saying that A123 was like the vector of how LFP got to China. I think they were already looking at it, the patents were out there. But the point is that America had a battery manufacturer. They weren't perfect. They certainly had some problems, but we had an LFP battery manufacturer, and we decided as a country, this is not strategically important. It doesn't matter if we sell it. And that turned out not to be true, because now the whole world is going electric and we don't have any American companies that can make our own batteries at scale. That's kind of the point. Like, everybody is tearing their hair out now about this bind that we're in, because we're in this big power rivalry with China, but we need them for everything. We saw that in the pandemic with like drugs or, chips or all kinds of things that we couldn't get. That really woke up people, not just the average person, but also in government, said, holy crap, like, being so dependent on China. We've been outsourcing all of our manufacturing, all of our jobs there since like the 70s, going outside the United States to the lowest cost country. And that was kind of our economic philosophy, is just outsource all this commodity stuff. We don't need to build things here. That's, we just need the knowledge economy. We just need the internet and technology, and that'll create all our jobs. And clearly that was a very flawed philosophy. And certainly people in Detroit, people in Michigan, and people in the Midwest who saw all those jobs go away, saw their communities being devastated by those manufacturing job losses, they feel this probably the most. But now it's like the whole rest of the country has woken up and seen the cost of that, in terms of it's actually now a national security issue that we cannot make things for ourselves. It's a very telling story that the U.S., tried, the Obama administration, they tried to support A123. I forgot to mention, they got like big grants when Jennifer Granholm was the governor of Michigan. She really propped them up and helped them get these grants. And this was at a time when the economy was collapsing. So the government was kind of just like urgent stimulus, like, let's just throw money at things because we need to get boots on the ground and shovels, and we need to be creating jobs because the economy is in real peril. But what happened was, the second that the market wasn't there, it became this political football. They said, the Republicans said, Obama's wasting money. He's throwing away your tax dollars. We shouldn't be doing this. The government shouldn't be picking winners and losers, which I understand that, there's a lot of veracity to that argument. But again, it's about having a long-term view. You have to think about strategically what is going to be important for our economy in the long term. And I think that's the kind of conversations we're having now. The reason I think this is a movie that is repeating itself is that, President Biden, with the Inflation Reduction Act, is almost trying to pick up where Obama left off and do it again. And like I said, he's trying to do two things. He's trying to, support EVs, but also basically, in some ways, he's also really doing the same thing that Trump was doing. That may be shocking for people to hear, but I mean, obviously Trump is not a fan of electric vehicles, but he's a big fan of manufacturing and manufacturing jobs. And that is what Biden is trying to do too. He's just trying to do that and couple it with green jobs and clean energy at the same time. But just like then, there's a lot of, we're starting to see a lot of political fights. The market is not immediately there. And so I think there's a risk that because of politics and because of, the realities of this is not China. We're not a state-run economy. And, our companies need to actually make money to survive. They don't just get, unlimited subsidies from the government to do something that's a loss maker for them.
There's just so much to unpack from that
I
because,
know.
and no, but it's a lot that we should talk about because I think it's all important. I was making notes here, so I apologize.
No, I'm sorry. That was a super long answer. It's a lot.
No, it's great. So number one, I think about these battery plant subsidies, because I have a
Mhm.
local lens. And I can't help but think one of the reasons why we have to offer so much subsidies is that we are not in a position of power because we don't have the technology. I think a lot of people view this through the lens of Ford, but should we also be viewing it through the lens of their partner, which has the technology and is important to getting this plant done? But since we don't have the tech, we don't have those things, we in some ways are making up with incentives for the leverage we don't have.
Those are two good points, but they're distinct. So first of all, I think we have an issue in this country with corporate incentives. And I wrote a whole other story about that, which I'd love to share with you, because I think this whole push with the pandemic stimulus and this push for battery plants and, reshoring manufacturing, that kicked off like a furious battle between the states for who could throw the most incentives at a company to win the plant and get the jobs, right? So I think that's just an American practice that it's part of the economic development model in all the states. It's people, I mean, it's not only money, that it's also about what kind of infrastructure do you have, or do you have a skilled workforce? Do you have, because it's one of the biggest problems now is just actually finding the people to work at your factory. The labor market is very tight. So at the state level, there's like corporate incentives have existed for decades and long before the EV showed up. But at the same time, yes, exactly. That is the idea. The idea is that China has been subsidizing this for a decade or more. And that's the whole thing about China. It's about people want a level playing field, and it is not a level playing field. China heavily subsidizes their EV makers, heavily subsidizes their battery makers. And it's very hard to actually get the exact numbers. They're not super upfront or transparent about it, shockingly. And not just that, you can take an example of LG, the Korean battery maker. When China started going electric as part of their national policy, LG said, okay, great, we're going to sell batteries to all these new Chinese EV companies. And they set up a plant in China to build, batteries. And then the Chinese government said, oh, there's a list of people who can sell to our companies and you're not on it. So they invested all this money to build a plant, and then the Chinese government blocked them. So you could say, hey, that's their industrial policy. That's their choice. They are picking their own winners. When the Chinese government or whoever talks about having competition with the US, that's why it's not a fair fight for us, because they're subsidizing people and keeping out competition in their own market, which is the largest car market in the world. And, there's different nuances to that. I mean, certainly GM, Volkswagen, Ford, they all have a presence in China and have made a lot of money over there over the years. But the cost for that there was also technology transfer. And there was also the Chinese government very wisely was saying, okay, well, we're not just going to make these little cheap screws for you. We're going to learn how to do what you're doing. And they did, And I think people were just very short-sighted and focused on all the great profits they were getting from, the growing middle class in China, and not thinking about, well, where's this going in the long run?
That makes me think of that cultural difference, having been around a little bit of, international business and things like that. There is a cultural difference where you have a country that looks at the quarter, right? We all know with Wall Street, in a quarter, a company can come completely out of favor. A company can be profitable on the books, but if it's out of favor with Wall Street, it's going to have problems. Very much that short-term quarter, half year, 1 year, 2 year focus. And then you have a country with a very strong industrial policy versus us, which we have scant to none, where they're like, theirs is so strong to the other side, where we don't care how much money we burn. If it's 10 years down the line, it's fine. We're going to spend what it takes in their mind to win, because they don't have those same pressures, because the Chinese government, it's not transparent. So we don't really know how much they're waving away.
Yes, that's, it's real easy when you have no democracy and no opposition. You don't have to worry about different stakeholders or, in some ways it's very simple. When you talk about the sort of financial quarterly mentality, that's one thing, but also at the government level, it's about every 4 years, and especially in the past decade. I mean, the middle is not a popular place right now. It's either one extreme or the other. Since I've been in Detroit, you had Trump, who was, going to war with California, trying to stop them from having any emission standards of their own and trying to roll things back. Then you have Biden, who's going back to the Obama years, and now he's pushing these very aggressive goals for he wants to make everybody sell electric cars and hybrids to clean up emissions. I mean, it's just like the auto industry is in the middle getting jerked around by this. And this is the thing, because people who don't like EVs, very understandably, they say, I don't want this shoved down my throat. I want a choice. And I think that's right. And that's very an American view, and that's fine. But the rest of the world is not waiting. China is not waiting. Europe is already going there. So you have to think about the automakers. They can't survive just selling to Americans. These are global car companies, and they can sell high profit pickup trucks, and that's really what makes the Detroit 3 run, is like, big trucks and SUVs. But if they're not competitive on electric vehicles, they're going to lose their, market share around the world and even here in the United States. So I think it's a dangerous thing to say, like, just be totally against it, because there's a big tsunami coming and you're just trying to put your finger in the dam, and it's not a long-term sustainable solution, I don't think.
But it also requires leadership to wrestle with that. A number of business leaders, I'm not trying to name them to insult them, because I think they have a lot of good reasons for why they think the way they do. But the idea being that, I listened to this presentation that EVs and automotive technology should not be a partisan issue, that it should be bipartisan. And there's poll results that show that the difference in opinion on electric vehicles pretty much lines up. If you're a Trump person, or if you're a Biden person, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, that defines how you feel about EVs for the most part. And they were saying, well, we really need to get post-political on this, and we need to come together. And with all due respect to them, I feel like that horse has really left the barn, especially if you look back to this A123 story.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting now. The picture is a little more complicated, because if you look at where a lot of these new battery plants and EV plants are going, a lot of it is actually in red states, or, Republican states like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee. So it's going to be interesting, because you've got all these red states that now have like tons of jobs coming their way thanks to electric vehicles. And I think that, that's also part of the picture of why Michigan has given the subsidies they have, because they are trying to hold on to the auto industry. And, I think that Michigan, we are still the center of engineering, like when you think about when people want to design a car and know how to make a car, the talent here, that is really concentrated here in Michigan. And of course, the companies are here, and there's a manufacturing footprint here. But yeah, so there's that little wrinkle that all these red governors and red states have EVs. But at the same time, that's nice, but that's not the reality. I mean, I've just spent the past few months of this year covering the UAW strike, talking to lots and lots of auto workers about how they feel about electric vehicles. And even the ones who are more liberal and lean Democrat, they still have anxiety, concern about their jobs because of EVs, and they're not unfounded. Like, that concern is legitimate. And I think, the UAW is trying to do the best they can to protect people through the transition. I mean, their position is, we're okay. We understand the EVs are coming. We understand this is good for the environment, and we want to make sure that our people are protected along the way. That's their view. It's very telling. There was that week, I don't know if it was like in October, I'm trying to remember, when both Biden and Trump came to Michigan, and you had, Biden right on there on the picket line with Sean Fain from the UAW. And then right after that, you had Donald Trump giving a speech where he basically just pressed that button and just spoke all of everybody's fears about EVs are going to destroy the auto industry. Come with me and I'll fix it. I won't let that happen. And it's just such a raw issue. I hear it from people all the time. And I think it's really should be very concerning for President Biden and the Democrats, that it's a real fear. And I think President Trump is very good at sort of taking those fears and really giving voice to them, and connecting with people on that. And I think that's happening, So I agree. I think long term, like, America needs to get competitive on battery technology and electric vehicles, but we've got to do that in a way that protects people as much as we can. But I don't know if there's not a perfect solution where you can't say you're not going to break any eggs with this revolutionary technological transformation. Like, it's not like, so there aren't going to be losers in there. But what I mean is, people who lose their jobs or have to go through a change. So I guess it's more about, who do you want to lead us through that change?
what are some of the advantages that Michigan has? Because they're not losing everything, right? This isn't all doom and gloom.
I don't want to speak beyond what I know. I mean, I cover the auto industry, so there's a lot about the Michigan economy that I don't know about, right? But what I do know is that manufacturing skills are very important. And it's one thing to work in an assembly plant, right? But even if you look at, some of the new battery startups that have come up around here, I visited a battery recycling plant recently, and a lot of these places, they're looking for people who have experience on a shop floor. I actually think that battery recycling is like one example of what could be actually a job creator in a growth area. When you think about electric vehicles and, people attack them and say, oh, well, it's so bad for the planet, it's not any better. Look at this mining. And they're absolutely right. Like, mining is a terrible thing for the planet. It's hard to put a pretty face on that, right? But in the long term, again, it's all about thinking long term and not just, what's right in front of your nose. There's a big movement. This is already happening in Europe and China, and there's big companies that are starting to grow here in the United States that are into battery recycling. So they're going to take those batteries, they're going to tear them apart, and they're going to smelt them down. They're going to take the stuff that's useful, and they're going to make new batteries out of them, or they're going to take those car batteries and repurpose them and put them in a stationary storage, like a utility grid. And so I visited one of those plants, and those are jobs. And there were guys with, power drills and all kinds of tools that looked like skilled tradesmen to me that were in there taking apart batteries. There also could be job creation here. And so I think probably the biggest asset that Michigan has in that respect is that we have people who know about manufacturing. And that could be an engineer, it could be someone a skilled tradesman, an assembly person, an operator on the floor. They're used to that kind of environment. So I think that's a good thing, because that's when you think about attracting investment and jobs, workforce is a huge thing. Look at the UAW contract. One of the interesting things about it was, this was a record contract on the part of wages and benefits, and they got COLA, their inflation adjustment, reinstated. But one of the things that they addressed, I know specifically in the Chrysler agreement, was absenteeism. And they're trying to use both carrots and sticks to get people to show up for work, because absenteeism and people not showing up was a real problem. So I think that's also part of it. I don't mean to sound patronizing, but if you talk to anybody who works in an auto plant, they'll tell you a lot of people just don't show up for work a lot of the time. So not everybody, but some people.
Well, it's a difficult job.
It's a difficult job. It does terrible things to your body. Absolutely. And I'm not trying to say that it's not hard, but I think our labor force is our biggest asset. And so we need to be good to keep the jobs. I think that's a big thing. And we are, but I'm just saying, that's the kind of thing that I think we need to keep in mind, because that's what's going to help us attract new jobs and investment.
Gabrielle Coppola, thank you so much. I mean, I feel like we have weaved through some fear, uncertainty, and doubt to that's what I love about doing this is, having an in-depth conversation and saying, okay, you know what, this is where we're at. And I think there are some ways that we can go forward, because as I've learned over the years, the only constant is change.
Yeah, it is. It's coming. That's the thing. Change is inevitable. So it's how do you best position yourself to deal with it? Yeah, someone could tell you they're going to make it all better and promise you the moon, and and I don't know. You just got to try to take a clear-eyed look at what's coming, and then decide, what's the best way forward.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us on Daily Detroit. I really appreciate you, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Thank you, Jared.
Don't forget to leave 5 stars on your favorite podcast app and share the show with a friend. With that, I am Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll talk tomorrow.